Welcome to DLS's teacher training module, Autonomous Learning, implementing semi-autonomous hours in the classroom. Let's get started. Let's discuss the objectives for this lesson. After this training, you will know what learner autonomy is and encourage it in the classroom, understand the purpose of semi-autonomous learning time, plan semi-autonomous learning time, and implement best practices for semi-autonomous learning time and developing learner autonomy. Before we begin, take a moment to consider the following questions that will be addressed in this module. What do we mean when we say learner autonomy? How do you encourage the students to be autonomous learners? What do you do during the hours designated for semi-autonomous learning? Pause the video for a minute while you write down your answers, and resume the video when you are ready to continue. Learner autonomy, we are talking about a student being able to take charge of their own learning. We can encourage students to be autonomous learners by involving them when setting objectives, determining types of activities that work for them, and generally reflecting on the learning process. During semi-autonomous learning time, work together with the student to set a basic agenda, answer specific questions as they come up, provide additional practice tools, and guide students as needed in self-paced activities. You may be familiar with the traditional classroom model where the instructor leads the class and gives lectures on particular topics. This is sometimes called the sage on the stage. In a traditional classroom, the focus is on the instructor. In student-centered classrooms, however, the instructor keeps focus on the students and uses activities and discussion to direct learning. This can be called guide on the side. They are there to guide the students through the learning process. How does learner autonomy fit into language learning? Learner autonomy encourages learners to get involved and engages them so that they share responsibility for the learning process. Learner autonomy also encourages reflection and helps learners to think critically when they plan, monitor, and evaluate their own learning. Since learning autonomy requires learners to take an active role in their lessons, how are the traditional roles of teacher and student affected? First, learning autonomy requires the understanding of new roles between teachers and learners. The promotion of autonomy is dependent on how aware teachers and students are of their new roles. Teachers' responsibility should be reinforced rather than reduced. Autonomous learning is not necessarily learning alone, nor is it learning without a teacher. Learners should still be guided by and receive feedback from their instructor. How can semi-autonomous learning environments be created and fostered? There are 5 aspects that we focus on. Learner training and counseling. Though your class is focused on language learning, students must also be trained on how to learn. Many students do not have effective language learning experience and will require training on reading and listening strategies, vocabulary retention, grammar practice, and more. They will also need to be counseled when they are struggling so that they can understand what their deficiencies are and learn to self-correct. Self-access materials and tools. The students need to be aware of the materials and tools that are available to them without the instructor. These tools include CL150, NFLC Portal, Gloss, Head Start, and many other language learning tools. You likely know of additional tools for your language, and your language training supervisor or the instructional technology specialist can help you find additional resources. Student-centered learning approaches. A student-centered learning approach allows the student more control over the space and type of activities that will help them reach their language objectives. The teacher can guide the student through this process. Student choice and voice. Listen to the student's needs and preferences to find the best approaches. The instructor should still be in control of the course and determining language objectives, but it can be helpful to listen to the student when they say they respond better to certain approaches or have a hard time completing certain activities. Reflection and self-assessment. Providing students with time to reflect on their learning and self-assess gives them the time they need to think about what they are learning. Students may be anxious about areas that the instructor thinks are going well. If there are differences between the student's opinion of their performance and the instructor's opinion, those differences need to be discussed. Allowing the student this time for self-reflection can be difficult for teachers, but it is very important to the student's learning process. There are several steps to the autonomous learning process. The process begins with setting goals. The goal should be decided by the teacher in conjunction with the student, keeping in mind the overall objectives of the student's mission and ILR goals. Next, the teacher and student should plan out what they need to learn and what kinds of topics will be covered. The teacher will often know the various resources available for the language learning task, but the student will be best at determining what works best for them. For example, using paper-based flashcards or online flashcards, or what type of grammar drills work best, oral or written. Another example is the reading and listening passages for practice. The student can choose what they are most interested in. Based on these resources, they should figure out the best strategies to use for learning. The student should always consider their own learning styles when planning. For example, does the student prefer direct or deductive learning, where the teacher presents the information, or indirect or inductive learning, where the student figures out the vocabulary or grammar from a larger context? Traditionally, students will rely on the teacher to drive the student to practice using the language, but practice can be driven by students to a great extent. For example, teachers can provide guidance on what the outcome should be, such as a presentation to a supervisor or an email to give directions, and the student can work on their own to practice the language, seeking guidance from the teacher as needed. While the student is practicing language, for example preparing for or performing a task, the teacher must monitor the student's progress. The teacher can do this by taking notes on what the student is doing well and not so well, or feeding the student hints as needed. The teacher should not be controlling the student's performance, however, as that should be in the student's control. Assessment should be a constant factor in the class. The assessment should be both informal and formal. Informal assessments can simply be feedback after a role play or presentation. Formal assessment should be regular as well. Constant assessment allows both the teacher and student to be very clear on where the class focus should be. Further, for informal assessments, such as for projects and assignments, it is important for students to revise their work over and over. Teachers can provide correction on assignments, but students must be taking time to revise the work and make the corrections. Finally, the teacher and student work together based on the informal and formal assessments to identify the gaps that exist in the language. This then informs the next goals that the student and teacher set to move forward through the cycle again. Now that we've learned about what semi-autonomous learning is and how to use it effectively, let's discuss how semi-autonomous learning time should be managed. You should spend up to 2 hours a day on semi-autonomous learning. This time can be in one large block each day or in smaller segments throughout the day. Work with your student to determine the best way to schedule semi-autonomous time. If the time is divided throughout the day, you need to decide how it will be divided and what tasks the student will work on for each semi-autonomous session. There should always be a plan, not simply free study time. Answering these time management questions will help learners stay on track and productive through semi-autonomous periods. Now that we have discussed what semi-autonomous learning time is, let's talk about what it is not. Semi-autonomous learning time is not an unstructured period where anything goes. It is not study hall, nor time to complete assigned homework. Students should not use the time to play around on the internet without a concrete task. It should not be used in place of assigning homework, and the instructor should be present during semi-autonomous learning time to better facilitate learning and monitor the student. When you are planning semi-autonomous learning time, consider the following questions. When will you do your semi-autonomous time? Some students may have more productive semi-autonomous times at different points in the day. A student may be most focused first thing in the morning or in the last 2 hours of the day. They might work better with 2 shorter periods a day instead of 1 longer one. Consider your student and their learning style when you are deciding when to schedule semi-autonomous time. What will the objectives be? Semi-autonomous time should always have clear objectives that the student and teacher have decided upon in advance. This will help the student remain focused and ensure the instructor knows what the student's goals are for their time. What will your role be? Decide on how involved you will be as the instructor during the semi-autonomous learning period. You may also be more or less involved depending on the student's objective or activity. What will the assessment be? Plan in advance how you will assess the student's progress during their semi-autonomous time to ensure that the time is being spent productively. Thank you for watching this presentation on semi-autonomous learning. If you have any questions, please contact your language training supervisor.